This episode of Dates and Dead Guys is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Click the link in the description below to keep your online identity safe. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. In the 1920s, there were still free Apache Indians living their traditional way of life. Yes, those 1920s. They lived in the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico, and there could have been as many as 100. It wasn't unknown or a mystery. The locals knew. They reported feeling watched. Rarely seeing, but knowing the Apache were near. They could hear sounds at night, animal calls that were just not quite right. They were warnings of Apache presence. Children were told not to play in the forest or stray too far from the watch of their parents. The Apache were raiders, known to take young children when they had the chance. More often, cattle or supplies would go missing. A tax ranchers had to pay because if they followed the trails into the hills, they likely wouldn't come back. You were taught that the Apache Wars ended in 1886 with the surrender of Geronimo, but they didn't. These Bronco Apache, as they were called by the locals, would fight on well into the 1930s, until a father, out of revenge, becomes determined to make them extinct. I'm warning you right now, there are no happy endings here. Let's get into it. It's October 1927. Riding on horseback, as fast as they can, a group of Mexican ranchers hurry to the location of the latest Apache raid. When they get to the scene, one man, moving with more urgency than the others, jumps off his horse and rushes to the body of a woman covered in blood on the banks of a trailside ravine. As the others secure the scene, he frantically checks the woman for signs of life. There aren't any. Stab wounds are all over her body. The man kneels and begins to sob. She was his wife. But after just a moment, he stands, and with a look of panic, he begins to search the area. Not seeing what he's looking for, he stares into the wilderness. His despair turns into rage. His son was with his wife, and the Apache had taken him. From that day forward, Francisco Fimbres would only live for two reasons: to get his son back, and to kill every damn Apache still living in those mountains. The Apache Wars ended in 1886, technically. That is when Geronimo and his band of about 40 Apache last surrendered to the American government. But Geronimo's Chiricahua were not the last of the free Apache. There were more holdouts. Estimates are just that, estimates, but there may have been as many as 100 or more Apache living in the Sierra Madre Occidental Mountains well into the 1920s. The locals called them Bronco Apache. They were the survivors. After centuries of constant war, they were still there. The Spanish and Comanche teamed up in the late 1700s to exterminate them. In the 1800s, the Mexican government paid scalp bounties to manhunters to see them wiped out, and the Americans dedicated a quarter of their standing army to bring in Geronimo. But well into the 1900s, they were still there. They would travel incredible distances, both on foot and by horse, always moving to keep from being discovered. They kept silent, hiding their presence. They would raid locals in rural areas, stealing livestock, but occasionally also killing ranchers or kidnapping women and children before disappearing without a trace into the mountains. To the Mexican, these Broncos were a menace. Boogeymen of an untamed wilderness. Always there, always watching. Never seen, but felt. Truly terrifying. And they all knew they were there. They would hear sounds, like animals, but not quite right. Hunting parties would find camps, still warm with the embers of fires, but with no one in them. To these Apache, the Mexicans were simply obstacles to their survival. In such small numbers, they were mostly left alone. But the Apache decision to raid the Fimbres family put an end to that. Prior to Francisco Fimbres finding his wife dead and his son missing, they were together. They were traveling near a small town in Sonora called Nacori Chico, where they lived. They had two horses. On a narrow mountain path, Francisco was riding along with his young daughter in the rear. Maybe 30 yards ahead was his wife Maria and 3-year-old son Geraldo. There, in the foothills of the Sierra Madre, the family continued down the winding path before turning a corner where there was a large boulder on the trail side. There are several versions of what happened next. In one, Maria had just rode past the boulder when Francisco heard the crack of a gunshot. He saw his wife fall from the horse, shielding Geraldo in her arms before a small group of Apache ran out from behind the boulder. In another version, there are no gunshots. and Maria is rushed and dragged off the horses by 2 or 3 Apache women and maybe a man that we'll talk about later. In either case, the Apache present immediately drew knives and began stabbing her. At this moment, Francisco Fimbres had to make a decision, among the worst I can imagine. Several accounts say he had a gun, either a revolver or a rifle. Some say he was unarmed, but most do say that he was. When he sees his wife attacked, what should he have done? Should he have marched forward to try to save his wife and son? Or does he think of his daughter, riding right there in his lap, and retreat in order to ensure her safety? Francisco retreated. He gets his daughter to safety, kind of. He dropped her off in a bush a ways down the trail before rounding up some local ranchers and heading back up the path. That's where he would find Maria's body and Geraldo missing. I've thought about this question a lot. Does retreating make Francisco a coward, or did he make the best choice that he could? There's a comment section. What do you think? I don't know that I have the right answer, but I do know that I would hate to make the choice. Regardless, I would bet everything I have that his guilt over this decision played a role in the revenge he was about to bring to the Apache. As soon as he was able, Francisco organized a rescue trip into the Sierra Madre in order to get his son. But a local girl, an Apache who had been adopted into the village as a teenager named Lupe, advised them against it. She didn't believe that Francisco could find the Apache in the mountains. She felt that no matter what he did, they would see him coming. Francisco tried to recruit her as a guide, but she refused to go. The last time she was with the Apache taught her better. She was too frightened of what they would do to her if they found her again. She said that the Broncos were led by Apache Juan, the man who may have been present when Maria was murdered. She said that he was a bad and cruel man. The plan she suggested was heartbreaking to Francisco. She wanted him to let the Apache go. She believed, through her experience, that if the Apache learned they were being tracked, they would kill Geraldo to get any pursuers off their trail. But if they thought that they were in the clear, they would adopt him, as they did dozens of captives over the years. After a while, Geraldo would become one of them. They would become attached and develop an affection for him, and hopefully become unwilling to hurt him. Then, after a few years, a rescue could be attempted. Francisco didn't take the advice. He is a father, of course he didn't. Riddled with guilt, he was set on a plan of action. Over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, he organized over 8 expeditions into the Sierra Madres to look for the Broncos. But, as Lupe predicted, he didn't find what he was looking for. Usually he found nothing. Sometimes he found trails or empty camps, but no Apache. Francisco tried to advance his tactics. He would conceal the presence of his expedition with darkened clothes. They avoided fires so that they couldn't be located by light or smoke, and they moved as much as they could in silence as possible. But they still found nothing. Anyone who has read about the Apache isn't surprised by this. During the Apache Wars of the 1800s, the U.S. was firm in their stance that only an Apache could find Apache, and they employed hundreds of them as scouts as proof of that fact. These Broncos were the needle in the proverbial haystack that is the Sierra Madre. But experience is valuable, and Francisco wasn't about to give up. At the same time Fimbres is conducting his expeditions in Mexico, an American named Grenville Goodwin is conducting research that will turn into several books on the Western Apache. He was deeply interested, probably in a very romanticized sense, that there were wild Apache in the Sierra Madres. He would track newspaper articles reporting anything about them and gather as much information as he could from his contacts at reservations like San Carlos. He even went on 2 expeditions to Mexico in order to try to make contact. He failed, as most did, at trying to find the Apache, but he kept journals of everything he learned that would later be published in a book called The Apache Diaries by his son. It's a great read. It does a lot to verify rumors around the story and answer bigger questions, like how the Apache were able to survive in the mountains from the 1880s on forward. First, the Apache were incredibly resourceful. They could hunt and forage for everything available in their environment, but they were not completely self-sufficient. They were not farmers, at least not at scale. They had to raid to supplement their needs. Most of the time, they wouldn't bother anyone. They were extremely cautious. Raids were small. They would take a cow or 2 from a farm here or there, rarely the same farm, at least not in a short time period. They knew to spread out what they took. Some of the farmers even claimed to know the Apache were doing it. They kind of viewed it as a tax. They knew if they went after them, they were never going to find the Apache, but if they tried, they would paint a rather large target on their back. They were a terrifying people to make an enemy out of. So no, let them take a cow here or there and they will simply return to the mountains. Some Broncos likely made visits occasionally to San Carlos or the Mescaleros Reservation. They would receive help from the Apache there. The Broncos were holdouts from the Indian Wars. The Apache there, although aging, likely knew who some of the Broncos were. There are enough sightings and accounts from people on reservation that make these visits almost certain. Lastly, sometimes they would simply walk into Mexican towns and trade. Many Apache spoke Spanish, at least enough to get by. There are reports of Apache camps discovered that had Mexican clothes. Dressed that way, speaking Spanish, many could go easily unnoticed, especially as many of the Apache were of mixed heritage. Lupe said that Apache Juan would do this, walk through towns, completely unnoticed. By 1930, Fimbres' attempts to rescue his son had garnered some regional attention. The Mexican government was hesitant to provide any assistance, at least officially, but Fimbres was able to get some support from eager volunteers in the United States. The Douglas Daily Dispatch invited people to enlist, and pretty soon American volunteers outnumbered Mexican. Their enthusiasm didn't go unnoticed. Some applicants wrote in asking to be included. I am not going to take the time to read them out loud, but I have posted 3 here if you want to pause and check them out. The venture was sold as the last Apache hunt, and the volunteers reflected that sentiment. But before it could get underway, the Mexican government shut it down. They were getting a little nervous at the idea of having hundreds of American militants on their soil, many of them not hiding the fact that they were also interested in the rumors of gold, silver, and copper in those mountains. But even without his volunteers, Fimbres escalated his pursuit, and his efforts paid off. In 1931, this bombshell hit the front page of the Arizona Daily Star. Quote, "Revengeful father returns with Indian scalps." End quote. In April 1930, after the punitive force of Americans was grounded by the government, Fimbres moved with 12 men from Nacori Chico on horseback. They were following a new lead and scouring an area of the Sierra Madre they had never been to before. Broncos had recently ambushed a small group between Nacori Chico and Casas Grandes. A few days in, they spot sign of Apache and smoke from a campfire. They approach the area in silence and with the utmost caution. At first, they see just 2 Apache, women. The group took aim and fired at them, hitting one in the arm. She screams Nakaye, the Apache word for Mexicans. The other yells for help, and she calls Apache Juan by name. Before the women can get away, the posse fires a second volley and kills them both. The Mexicans see other Apache fleeing into the forest, but Apache Juan ran toward the group and began firing back, staying behind to defend his tribe, despite being drastically outnumbered. Fimbres' team was able to pin him down behind cover before one of the group flanked him. The initial shot injured him before the group moved in and finished what they started. In the silence after the fight, the Mexicans then inspected the camp. They took valuables like saddles and rifles, as well as Apache trinkets that they found as souvenirs. But before they left, they made 2 very serious mistakes. They scalped the dead, and they left the bodies unburied and in the open. Fimbres hoped that by being so brazen, that maybe the Apache would fear him, and they would free Geraldo to get them off their backs. But that's not what they do, and this is not that kind of story. The image published in the Arizona Daily Star is, in essence, a victory photo. Despite the warnings of Lupe, Fimbres thought this was the path to getting his son: fear and intimidation. The Mexican government took this tactic throughout the last century, but all of that history with the Apache should have told him that it wouldn't work. Failing to understand the Apache cost him everything. A couple days after the expedition that killed Apache Juan and the 2 women, 2 Mexican men riding horses in the area of the fight caught the smell of decay and investigated. The 3 Apache, who were left out in the open, had been carefully buried by their companions when they later returned. But next to their graves was another. Buried shallow and with his legs sticking out was the body of Geraldo. There were obvious signs of torture. He would have been about 7. Accounts from friends of Fimbres say that at this point he was a broken man. His primary motivation before was to get his son back. Now he only lived for revenge. Blood feuds dominate the story of Native American history, and this one is no different. A piece of tragic irony in this story is that from Fimbres' perspective, his mission came from wanting vengeance for his wife and to save his son. But that attack was likely not a random act of violence. Around 1915, 12 years before the attack on the Fimbres family, the Broncos had stolen some cattle, and a group of ranchers, including Fimbres, caught up to them. In doing so, they capture a young Apache girl. She lived with the Fimbres family for a while before being baptized and adopted by another. She believed, since she was taken, that Nacori Chico was constantly being watched and that the Fimbres family was marked by Apache Juan and her mother. At one point, a few years after her capture, she asked to rejoin her people, and the community decided to let her. She went up into the mountains and found her family. But she was told that she was no longer welcome with the Apache, and that if she returned, that they would kill her. That little girl was Lupe, the same Lupe who had been giving Fimbres advice since the attack in 1927. She believed that the woman who pulled Maria off that horse was her mother, and that taking Geraldo was essentially an exchange, a child for a child. She also believed, from the descriptions given to her from Fimbres, that the Apache women killed in 1930 was her mother and her sister. The violence between the Broncos and the Fimbres family had been going on now for nearly 2 decades, but it wasn't over. In 1934, Grenville Goodwin estimated that there were around only 30 of these Broncos left. He made these estimates based on the amount of cattle taken on ranches in the area and what the Apache would need in food in order to sustain themselves. It's for sure not a perfect estimate, but it does give us a starting point. He wrote of the Broncos, quote, "They are fighting a losing battle in Mexico, and it seems only a question of time till they will be exterminated," end quote. But news didn't travel especially fast to the United States, and by 1934, that may have already happened. Despite his attempts, Grenville Goodwin missed some news. He had issues with tuberculosis and was out of commission for large chunks of time in the 1930s. There is an incomplete record, and frankly, at this point in the story, I am not sure what is true and what is legend. Some of the conflicts appear to be reported twice by different people on different timelines with different details, but this is what can be put together. In the spring of 1933, several sources claim Fimbres led a group of ranchers on an expedition that killed 24 Apache. But that fight mirrors one reported in 1932, in which far less Apache are killed. In both, 3 children are taken, each of them dying within a year. There was a report out of Tucson in September of 1934 that is eerily similar to one in 1935, in which a group including Fimbres ambush Apache coming down from cover in the mountains following a heavy snow. What does seem consistent is that in 1935, reports stopped. So, were all the Apache dead? I don't think so. In 1937, a Norwegian explorer, Helge Ingstad, led an expedition into the Sierra Madres in search of any remaining Apache. He didn't find them, leading many to assume they were all gone. But there is more to that story. First is that the expedition may have found more than was reported. Ingstad had 2 Apache guides. One of them, Yanoza, was a former warrior who had surrendered with Geronimo way back in 1886. At one point during the expedition, Ingstad separated from his guides for a few days. They never told him, but reported to people on Reservation later that they didn't find any Apache, but they did find a camp with evidence of Apache there recently. Whether that is true or not, I have no idea. But a year later, in 1938, Grenville Goodwin was visiting the Mescaleros Reservation. There he was told by 2 separate people of wild Apache who had visited the year before. The witnesses said they spoke Spanish. And in the decades that follow, there are other rumors that are hard to ignore. There was a story of a woman in Colorado who said her parents were from a small settlement in the mountains west of Chihuahua City. They would tell stories of their village and say that everyone there was related. She said that when her children were little, her parents would speak to them in Apache. They left the village in the 1950s. An anthropologist named Tom Hinton met a man who spoke with 4 men describing themselves as Apache in 1948 in the area south of Nacori Chico. The people who live in this area are mostly mountain Pimas, Native Americans. Hinton was told the men were wearing buckskin clothing and moccasins, and that they claim to have been descended from the Chiricahua. It's not unlikely that a small number who survived moved to different locations or assimilated themselves into small Mexican towns or communities. But a more romanticized view is that maybe a small population still lives out there. The region is unbelievably rural, the land is there, and to this day, every so often, someone reports having seen them. It's not likely, but I know if I ever find myself in the Sierra Madre, the most terrifying thing I can imagine is getting the feeling of being watched, or hearing sounds I can't quite explain. It seems like every free second I am trying to read more about history or respond to comments from the channel. Something that means I'm using public Wi-Fi networks in hotels or gas stations that are less than trustworthy. So I use Surfshark to keep my online identity safe. Their VPN service encrypts all of the information sent from my devices, like my phone, tablet, or laptop, before it is sent out to the World Wide Web, where big companies can gain access to my unencrypted data, or cybercriminals can do even worse with it. So why not have seamless protection? Well, that's what Surfshark does, and that is just one feature. Surfshark's clean web service blocks ads, trackers, malware, and phishing attempts, making surfing the web truly safer and more enjoyable. Additionally, you'll be able to change your virtual location. That means that you can access the internet from anywhere around the globe, thereby bypassing any censorship where you are and giving you access to resources and information everywhere as a citizen of the world. I don't think that this will surprise anyone, but here at Dates and Dead Guys, we are not fans of censorship. And by we, I do just mean me. I work alone. That's why these videos take so long to make. To try Surfshark and keep your data safe, use the link below. Use the promo code DatesAndDeadGuys to get an extra 3 months free. Everything you need is in the description below. And thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. Thanks for watching the video. I hope that you enjoyed it and you come back to check out some of the other ones on the channel. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future videos, please send them in, and we'll hopefully get to all those.